Cool. I think I'll get started now. So thank you so much for coming to this talk. This is stepping into new patterns, pathways for healing through dance rhythm games. And just a content warning, there will be discussions about trauma, nothing too graphic. It'll be kept more at a high level, but feel free to take any accommodations that you need. So my name is Jackie. I am an artist and designer based in New York City. And in my practice, I make hyper-personal interactive memoirs that often experiment with the web as a medium. And I'm coming to NarraScope as a little bit of an outsider and newbie to the games industry and games writing world. And a lot of my existing game work has been solo projects, give or take an occasional collaborator for music. And I'm coming into game making through starting out with the practice of making websites as art. A few years ago, I made my first memoir game and game in general, Child Being a Read Only Memory Experience, which is a CD-ROM edutainment style memoir game about childhood memories. My next game work was a Game Boy game, Fishing for Average Caucasian Boyfriends, which is a 5-minute micro visual novel that uses the tropes of a very boring fishing game to meditate on heteronormative expectations, queer identity, and the possibilities of dreaming bigger. I've also made less game-like art, but still interactive narrative work, such as I Feel So Much Shame, which is a net art piece exploring themes of shame and desire, made fully with risograph printing, a printing process that is both mechanical but also handmade feeling. It's popular within illustration comic zine circles, and where the labor intensiveness and materiality of the piece itself became its core revelation. So lately, I've been reflecting a lot about what my art is and why it is the way it is in terms of being super personal, in terms of dealing with memory, nostalgia, and making interventions into the past. And I realized a lot of it relates to my experiences with CPTSD and the search to heal from it. And just a primer on what I mean by CPTSD, I'm talking about complex post traumatic stress disorder, or complex trauma for short. And another disclaimer, I don't have any training in psychology or mental health practice. I just am a big fan of therapy and I read a lot about this stuff. So might get little pieces off. If I do, don't mind me. Um, so a lot of us might be familiar with the term PTSD, which stems from a single traumatic event. CPTSD is what happens after going through ongoing trauma that one can't escape from. So often in childhood, and examples of this might be growing up in war or experiencing violence in the household. But it can also occur from what people call little t trauma, smaller experiences that might otherwise seem not that bad, and can even come from households that are loving. So little t trauma might be things like chronic neglect or misunderstanding, unpredictable environments, or never being modeled healthy conflict repair or apology. And the result of CPTSD are a whole range of symptoms, including difficulty with how you view yourself, your relationships, your trust in others and the world, and specifically developing these extreme coping mechanisms in order to protect against pain, even when original stressors are long gone. My first deep dive into learning about CPTSD was in 2022, reading What My Bones Know, a memoir by Stephanie Fu, who is a Malaysian-born American journalist who documented her own journey learning and recovering from CPTSD from a journalistic point of view. She also explored intergenerational trauma within the Asian diaspora in the Bay Area where she grew up. And reading her memoir was heavy, but also cathartic for me. And while a lot of our experiences were different, I did see myself in some of them too. I specifically related to one of her coping mechanisms, which was hyperproductivity and chasing achievements to the point of burnout. And Stephanie also talks about how difficult it is to really untangle and heal CPTSD. The extreme coping mechanisms become so learned and ingrained that they feel like part of your personality. And the effects of trauma are intertwined with the body. They can create chronic health issues, which can even be passed down generations. And CPTSD healing is a long process and often takes years at minimum with a trained therapist. But what ultimately stuck with me about the memoir most was its hope towards a pathway for healing. And towards the end of the memoir, she talks about this intensive work she does with her therapist, Dr. Ham, who she quotes as saying, and I'll just read it all out loud, because of its repetitive nature, complex trauma is fundamentally relational trauma. In other words, this is trauma caused by bad relationships with other people, people who were supposed to be caring and trustworthy and instead were hurtful. That meant future relationships with anybody would be harder for people with complex trauma because they were wired to believe that other people could not be trusted. The only way you could heal from relational trauma, he figured, was through practicing that relational dance with other people. Not just reading self help books or meditating alone, we had to go out and practice maintaining relationships in order to reinforce our shattered belief that the world could be a safe place. And so this image of the relational dance has stuck with me ever since I read the memoir. And 3 years later, I asked myself, what is my version of this? If Stephanie Fu, a journalist, created a journalistic approach to documenting and healing her CPTSD, what could my version of this be as an artist who makes weird games? So I started with the idea of the relational dance. Okay, and this is a video. Yay. Relational Dance Dance is a work in progress interactive memoir that remakes and reimagines the mechanics of dance rhythm games to explore memories stored in the body, relational healing, and learning new patterns through embodied play. I'm planning to release RDD online on itch.io for keyboard play, but I've also been exploring physically installed versions where you can play with a real dance mat. And in this talk, I'll just share about my ongoing process of writing and building this game over the past year. So my projects usually start with a shower thought type of idea. In early 2025, I was looking for ways to do cardio indoors in the winter in my apartment and decided to get a DDR mat to play an open source version of DDR at home. And I also played as a kid, so I just wanted to get a little better at it. And around that time, my first idea of combining it with something mental health related came from thinking about the connection of DDR with EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This is a type of body-based trauma processing technique, which comes from the idea that traumatic memories can be processed properly with bilateral stimulation or left-right bodily movements, like looking back and forth with your eyes from left to right, walking, or maybe even DDR. So this project stayed in this idea phase for a while until the spring of last year, when I applied with the idea to Vector Game Art Residency in Toronto, where I got in, and I basically had like a 1 month in a game jam type of timeline to create the game and share it at their festival show in July. And the prompt of the residency was video games and memory. And for my project, I thought about the angle of body memories. So not memories as singular specific events with a time and a place, but the way memories in CPTSD act, which are experienced in the bodies. So emotional states, stories you tell yourself, coping mechanisms, familiar sensations, muscle memories. I was also interested in drawing more explicitly on internal family systems, a trauma healing framework popularized in the past several years that offers the idea that we are all multiple, we're always multiple, we have multiple parts within us. There are our exiles, our inner child parts that hold our pain and our wounds, our protectors, our defensive coping mechanisms that try to cope against feeling those wounds, and a core self, an inner essence within all of us that we all have that is capable of healing and being a leader for all of our other parts. So trauma causes our parts to become extreme, fragmented, and disjoint. This is where internal conflict comes from and where a lot of our personal suffering is rooted in. And healing requires recognizing and listening to all of our parts, softening our defenses enough in order to heal our wounds at a foundational level. So planning the game for the art residency started with this question of what are my defensive parts? What are my body memories? What are my coping mechanisms? And using that as the basis to guide the structure. So in the earliest storyboard of the game, I imagined something with like a typical DDR gameplay with a typical intro, game menus, and then you could go through 5 songs based off of my own body memories or anxious coping mechanisms, including a song called Walking on Eggshells to the tune of Walking on Sunshine, a kung fu song about self-blame, a song about chasing breadcrumbs, a song that's like a cowboy western song about hyper independence, and some sort of techno song about dissociation and filling the void. And then I imagined some sort of final experimental song represented of the process of healing or the new patterns that I wanted to eventually learn. And it was meant to be more unlike the other 5, more liminal, and break the expectations of the normal gameplay and reconstruct it back into a new version of the game. So that was the end vision for my piece, but remember I had 1 month to pull together some slice to share for the residency. And my first step when it came to building was just figuring out the technical portion, figuring out the technical basis for a DDR style rhythm game. Luckily, rhythm game and DDR communities have a lot of prior knowledge and skills to work with. I learned about the open source DDR project Stepmania, and they have a particular file format, SM file, that captures the DDR step patterns. So if you can see here, it's a text file. The numbers in the characters represents the arrows that would show up in a DDR song. And my earliest technical prototypes didn't even use my own music or step patterns. I just focused on downloading music from the internet and getting that to work in a web-based prototype, which I created in JavaScript and P5.js. Then came actually developing the thing that I would want to show for the art residency. And because I couldn't make the full game in the span of 1 month, I focused on the slice of the ending. And very fortunately, I was also able to enlist a friend, Patrick Ekbuchalem, and who's in composition school currently, who was excited to jam with me on the project. And for this ending, I wanted it to be poetic and experimental, and I imagined instead of getting a score for hitting the notes, getting great or perfect or bad, you would progress the narrative, and it would trigger the poetic narrative to show instead of the feedback. And writing this part looked basically like locking myself in a cafe for a few hours and doing my favorite activity, which is cry writing, until I had something that I could massage into a format that kind of resembles song lyrics. Remember, I wanted these to match up with the music, so that's kind of why I grouped them into these stanza-like formats. And then after this, even without the music, I started scoring the notes as well, which I was able to do also on an open source tool called SM Editor, which can export to the SM text file format. So really glad to have all these pre-existing tools at my disposal. I created this really unstyled version of a prototype just to see it all hooking up together. And then here's another prototype once the music came in, and then I started using the actual assets. Okay, highly recommend documenting your process on Instagram stories because it'll be easy to use in talks. And yeah, I had a really lovely time at this residency in Toronto. I was really grateful to be able to share such an early MVP of the project and still have it be well received, even though it was one tiny slice of an entire narrative. I also learned that what I created is it's on the harder side for DDR players, so that was something I kept in mind. But there was a lot more game to build after this residency and after kind of having a crazy summer where I took a short break to move apartments in New York right after coming back from Toronto. It was back to working on the project and particularly taking more time for research. So, of course, I thought it was important to get a critical, deeper understanding of Dance Dance Revolution, the game I was trying to recreate and subvert. So I read the Boss Fight Books edition about DDR and its place within rhythm game history. On the psychology side, I also read No Bad Parts, a book about internal family systems by the creator of IFS, Richard Schwartz. I also got firsthand research. So I started understanding the scene for Dance Dance Revolution within New York City through a friend, Connie, who I met once at a party, but who I saw play DDR on Instagram stories. So I do a lot of Instagram stories. And the rest is history from there. And I got to meet a lot of DDR regulars, as we call them, learning tips and tricks to become a better player myself. And I really got to get a more intuitive understanding for a lot of the mechanics behind DDR and the culture. This isn't me, by the way. And I would say this research, both the theory and the practice of it, led to several main observations. One, the first being DDR has a strong culture of remix and remaking. It's a game that's constantly given new life to and meaning to, from competitors in open source versions like Stepmania, Korean Pump It Up, In the Groove, to official collaborations with Mario, Hello Kitty, or Disney. To really weird off-brand versions like this Veggie Tales Dance Dance Dance. To web games like Flash Flash Revolution and Friday Night Funkin'. To projects in the art world like Dance Dance Chromatics, which I think is in Singapore, and Dance Poem Revolution by an artist in Brooklyn. So in the context of my project, I'm really interested in this question of what does it mean for me to remix DDR? What parts of it am I recreating versus which parts am I reimagining? Another theme in DDR gaming is the mechanic of being able to unlock secret hidden modes and songs using cheat codes. This is where the Konami code comes in, or by scoring well enough. There's also an interesting tension between playing to get perfect full combos, PFCs as they call them, really optimizing your movements to get a high score versus dancing more expressively. Both are valid ways to play the game, but they exist in tension with each other. And finally, I've been thinking about arcade rhythm games and arcade culture in general as sites for connection. I think it's really funny that Dave and Buster is just Dave and Buster for a lot of people, but around the DDR machine specifically, it's like a secret third space. There is something very poetic about the physical, material qualities of DDR that asks you to be in shared space together, to experience the same things side by side, to mirror each other. So when I resumed the game dev work at the end of fall, it was time to focus on the beginning of the game instead. So if the ending I had made for the residency was a poetic, experimental, deconstructed version, this part needed to be more standard, traditional DDR gameplay that I can then deconstruct. And remember, this was all about translating body memories or the anxious coping mechanisms and figuring out how that expresses in the gameplay. So I first started prototyping the menus of the game, including the song selector, but ultimately the bulk of the work would be on the actual art, music, and gameplay of these 5 songs. And I was also really lucky to have some dedicated time in December 2025 to focus on this through a 1-month residency at Visual Studies workshop in Rochester, New York, where I lived in a tiny 1-bedroom cabin and experienced Rochester winter and had a forced break from the constant chaos and distraction of New York. And also got to meet Nielsen Carroll, who works at VSW and is here and will give a talk on art games tomorrow. It was really cool to experience game culture in Rochester. I visited the Strong Museum of Play, which actually has DDR installed in the museum. And this time was a pretty fitting environment to actually sit down and learn Blender, which I've been scared about using before. It just has too many buttons. I can code, but like anything with buttons, I get scared. And I could focus on the production work for these main songs. And as the music came in from my collaborator, Patrick, I slowly began to carve out worlds for each of these characters who are experiencing these body memories to go along to sort of like music videos for them. So I was trying to represent each body memory through choices like the music itself, but also the body-based DDR specific mechanics, the design of the characters and their environments. And part of this process was also letting myself be really silly, campy, and exaggerated with these video work and pull in a lot of pop culture references and tropes, which I think actually in the subject of how do we create the boundaries of making work when we're making super personal work actually helped me toe a line of creating really personal work without actually having to reveal any details about specifics in my life. And I think this choice also allowed me to focus on the emotional body aspects of these experiences and also tap into cultural memory and nostalgia, which is cultural memory. The result of this was 5 songs about my anxious coping mechanisms, walking on eggshells, to the tune of Walking on Sunshine, where you dance as a chicken character in a happy green farmland, but then you encounter the danger of mine-like eggshells that you must carefully step around. The next is Kung Fu Fawning, inspired by classic DDR song Kung Fu Fighting. You dance as a Kung Fu disciple version of me who goes through diligent training montages, and her fight scenes are replaced with fawning, bent into poses of praying, bowing, and serving. There is Chasing Breadcrumbs, inspired by Europop music like Aqua Barbie Girl and Toy Box's Best Friend. And you dance as like a Y2K beach girl who goes on a car chase for a baguette-shaped car who's leaving a trail of breadcrumbs on a California coastline. And in this song, we introduce sudden, unpredictable stops in the music to represent the experience of intermittent reinforcement. There is Lone Ranger, which is inspired by songs like Cotton Eye Joe and DDR song Cowgirl. You dance as a cowgirl version of me to line dance type of music after getting ghosted, and you play along to the tropes of the cowboy western hyper-independent Lone Ranger. And then there is Fill the Void, which is the hardest of all songs, referencing classic DDR final boss songs like Paranoia. It's a techno song that plays with changing tempo, capturing my experiences of dissociation, both by cycling between frenzied busyness and collapse. So, in the internal family systems framework, we can do our best to recognize the roles each of our defensive coping mechanisms may play in trying to protect ourselves and make all of these parts feel seen, recognized, not antagonized or banished. So after dancing to each song and literally allowing yourself to mirror the bodily sensations that the body memory represents, passing each song allows you to receive a revelation about the coping mechanism, which I try to write as expressions of gratitude or acknowledgement, and then you get one step closer to unlocking the ending. And I think, in a sense, the painstaking and time intensive process of learning to design, 3D model, animate, and film these music videos for all of these parts of myself has been a healing process too. It's forced me to know all of these parts of myself, to know these sensations in my body so intimately, and to spend a lot of time with them. For example, a long time I've been really embarrassed about a lot of my coping mechanisms. I think it's easy to cringe and to beat myself up thinking about the part of me, for example, that might chase unavailable people, but I can also learn to love her too. She's bold, she's brave, and she's very stylish. So the last big chunk of work that I've been chipping away at most recently has been creating the transition to the ending. So at this point, I had the traditional DDR gameplay representing old patterns, and then I had the ending that was more poetic, representing the new patterns. So I needed to figure out what happened in the middle. And in terms of healing CPTSD, you could see this as what happens in between releasing old patterns, old relational patterns, and stepping into new ones. In IFS, this is seen as meeting the exiles, So being able to encounter the wounded parts of yourself that you might have hidden away long ago, reacting not with defensiveness or avoidance, but by listening to them and comforting them. So when you hear inner child work or the idea of reparenting the inner child, this is what that usually means. And despite how nice this WikiHow image looks, it's a process that can be pretty painful and difficult and hard for people to access because trauma defenses can be so wired to avoiding that pain. And it's also ultimately a highly advanced stage in the CPTSD healing process because to get to this point, it means you are able to do the difficult work of softening your defenses enough in the first place, to pause your default programming, to choose differently. Fittingly, this part of the game was also the most difficult to write, both emotionally and game design wise, but my research eventually brought me to rabbit holes exploring the arcade service menu, these secret menus that arcade operators can access that are used for maintenance and testing of the machines. And I was interested in this idea of the menu hidden below a surface layer as something that could represent my inner wounds, protected from view from the surface of my coping mechanisms. And I liked the idea of unlocking this stage of the game by completing all 5 songs, in a similar way to unlocking access to my inner wounds by listening to my parts, by giving them acknowledgement. My early experiments with this scene actually started trying to follow the menu format one-to-one, and convey some sort of inner dialogue through the format of the menu UI. But I thought there was some complexity in turning this fort into narrative, specifically with a menu. It doesn't require you to go through it linearly, but it was kind of difficult to get my message across and think about the complexities of that format. But I also luckily learned about arcade test sequences or self-tests, which were a similar part of early arcade machines. And these happened automatically and ran by themselves on boot up and progressed in a more linear way. So my latest iteration of this service mode scene combines elements of the two, the linear structure of the boot up sequences, but with the light interactive elements of the menu format, using the language of input-output, hardware checks, and computer memory to explore the core belief, the core wound at the heart of my anxious coping mechanisms. The belief that I am in some way responsible for how others people treat me, the belief that there's something wrong with me that I need to fix, the belief that I necessarily can be in control of whether I get hurt, whether it is through avoiding mistakes, being careful enough, being perfect enough, or avoiding opportunities to experience pain altogether. To release these beliefs is to face that the alternative is also painful and scary, that we can't truly have control over how people treat us, that sometimes things happen that we just don't deserve, and we can never fully protect against pain. It can feel like powerlessness, but it can also be freeing. To grieve the lack of control is to also invite new possibilities in its place. After the test mode sequence, the game reboots into a new version of the game. Where its pieces are very familiar, but everything is different at the same time. And in the end, I speak directly to the player of the game, reaching out through the screen and invite them to practice the dance with me as well. Okay. When I think of the relational dance, I think of it as something that has multiple meanings. There is the relational dance within myself in creating work where I've had to really sit down and understand all of my parts enough to put them in a game. There's the relational dance between myself, the artist, and the player as I create work that makes myself vulnerable, put it out into the world, and be witnessed to be mirrored by others. And there's the relational dance within the people who might play my piece, who might bring their own experiences and might think of themselves and their parts in a new light. I'm seeing the function of art as a relational healing process in and of itself. We heal through seeing ourselves and letting ourselves be seen by others. We heal through putting ourselves and the things we create out into the world and all of our messiness and complexities and imperfections. We heal through doing the difficult work over and over to let the embodied act of creation be what changes us. Here, the making and the remaking of the game is its conclusion. As if there is a soul inside learning to finally speak, the game assembles itself from the only language it already has to rebuild itself anew. As if there is an inner self and an inner power that has always been there the whole time. So what's next for RDD? As of right now, Relational Dance Dance is still work in progress, but almost done, working really hard on it, and hoping to launch by the end of the year, maybe fall. But I'm also hoping to find more places to share this and exhibit it in person. So if you're interested in having it at your festival, conference / DIY space, feel free to talk. And you can play a demo of it here at NarraScope in the experience on a real DDR mat that I carried by myself on Amtrak. And don't worry, I made it so that you can't fail the songs after a lot of user feedback at shows. So I'm excited to be sharing it here. I'm still learning a lot myself about narrative games and writing, so I'm looking forward to getting critical feedback, especially on the service mode part of the game, which I'm gonna try to workshop a little more and do another round of design on. And I also hope that in turn RDD and this talk can offer some perspectives for you all, whether it is using IFS as a framework to explore and resolve internal conflict within writing complex characters, thinking about spaces for hyper-personal narratives that wouldn't necessarily be able to exist in traditional game industry systems, and seeing ways that game making can be a deeply transformative or relational process for yourself. So thank you so much, and this is where you can find me on the internet. I'm sweaty. Looks like we have 10 minutes, a little more. Yeah, happy to take questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can see when you told me earlier that I put it back. So that's
Oh, yeah.
it's good that you explained it. I'm kind of curious what the interactions were, and or around the interactions and reactions were from the community on Instagram, because a lot of this really is kind of going more like 90s and early 2000s in terms of the audience that would have experienced this. So I'm kind of curious if you've got a lot of people who actually identify with these experiences, or people who are kind of like neutral.
Do you mean identify with the mental health parts or the DDR? Yeah, I would say I think a mix on both. Like, I think the average person I talk to knows what DDR is, but maybe isn't like an expert of it, or they're like, "Oh, I know of that. I'm really bad at that." I feel like that's the most common audience member for the game. But I also have like friends and like people at this conference too that are like, "Oh yeah, I have a setup in my basement." Um, I think very rarely do I meet people who haven't heard of it in general, or if I show them a picture, I think they'll be like, "Oh yeah, that." I think in terms of the mental health stuff, I would say generally, I think people can understand what I'm trying to get at, especially in the 5 original songs. Like I would say most people have heard the term walking on eggshells. I think the only person who didn't know that term that I've talked to was someone who's an international student from China. I think maybe just she just doesn't have that language or is used to that language. But I think I'm interested in like I think purposefully like playing on a lot of tropes that exist on like therapy, mental health carousels that you might see on social media. So I'm trying to really build off of existing cultural memory and discourse right now. Yeah. Hi. I'll start with you. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah. First of all, this was so cool.
Thank you.
For they can replay it. I'm curious whether you're concerned about there being a difference in experience between playing on the keypad versus playing on the DDR machine itself. Because like there is a world in which you would make this like a DDR machine only game that's like only exhibited and like experience, which would limit the engagement. But I'm just curious about your thought process like that.
Yeah, that's something I'm definitely thinking about. And I think as I'm building the game, I'm trying to keep both in mind. Like I think in the UI examples you can see, I'm referencing like there's a keyboard or like there's an enter key. So I'm kind of designing it with the assumption that like the bass player will be seeing it on itch.io and playing it with keyboard, hoping that it could do well online. Um, and I'm trying to think of the physical installs as sort of like limited experiences that I kind of curate more because I think there are people who have the DDR mats, but I think it may be hard to accommodate all different hardware that people have. And I think on like the more thematic level, um, I do feel like playing it with a body is like the fullest experience because a lot of these step patterns are like literally make your body go in a certain motion. Um, and I hope that the metaphor can translate to people who are like doing it with their fingers. So yeah, that was a really good question. It's something I'm definitely thinking about more. Oh yeah.
Great talk. As a Chinese growing up playing like absolutely no DDRs, this is really like I feel like it's really the first time I played the game feels really special to me because it's also very nice that you cannot fail at all. So and but DDR have been inside me the idea of DDRs is that they're so freaking hard and they're so challenging and the stress is crazy and everyone is looking at you and if you miss a note you're like absolute trash.
Yeah.
But I feel like just having this and then having another theme that covers it up and then have an overarching narrative experience really help alleviate the stress of like, oh, this is just a DDR. It's all about competition. It's all about like full combos and stuff. So I think it's a really beautiful spin on the genre. Well, I guess the question is, what was your conclusion on why making this on the DDR? What is your like at the end? What did you figure out? Why it's in the DDR game instead of a keyboard game?
Yeah. I mean, like sorry, is the question is like why did I use DDR as a theme in general? Or
Yeah, yeah.
okay,
So
okay.
both at the first place.
Oh
What's
yeah.
your thoughts on why specifically DDR?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of my games I like to pull from game genre tropes. So my previous game was the Game Boy game, like a fishing game, and that's also like a really overdone trope, classic trope that I'm pulling from. And I like to think about the genre as a metaphor for something else that's unrelated to it. So for the Game Boy game, I was thinking like boring game and then like social expectations, games that you have to play um, in your social world. So for this, I'm thinking about DDR's the I think classic rhythm game, like one of the first rhythm games that became big. And it's also very body based. So I felt like that was a really good foundation to make a game that is about healing through the body and explore a lot of different angles about that. Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah.
I guess wondering about the how you're writing the charts, like and how they correspond to the like the scenarios or the you know the yeah the theming for the charts. Like I guess I can imagine for some of them like walking on eggshells, like how that might translate. But for all of them, did you kind of try to match the steps and the charts with like the theme?
Yeah, most of them I'm trying to build in some inherent mechanics of it that relate to the emotional experience somehow. So in the chasing breadcrumbs, it stops. So that's supposed to represent like when you're chasing breadcrumbs or like going after unavailable people, you kind of have to adjust to like sporadic communication, and like that creates some like risk reward, like gambling in your brain. So I think that one also, when I play test it with people, people are like really shocked. They're like, what's happening? And like really thrown off by that. So in that sense, I kind of want that negative experience to mirror that emotional experience. For the Void techno song, it goes from fast to slow. So thinking about like really frenzied, like keeping busy to be productive, and then like being collapsed, so tired from that, and then cycling back through that. I think the only one that I don't have a DDR specific mechanic for is the Lone Ranger song, which is supposed to be about hyper independence. I just couldn't figure out something that the arrows could do. If anyone has ideas, let me know. So I just really tried to be like, okay, you're a cowboy, this one. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of charting the steps, I think it also helped to play a lot of DDR in the arcade, and I got to see like the sort of extremes to which the songs are pushed. Like for Chasing Breadcrumbs, we have the stops, and there's actually a song called Chaos, which is like one of the songs that has like a million stops, and it's like notoriously like a really difficult meme song just to like throw you off. So it's fun to like translate those um, kind of classic DDR experiences into this somehow. Cool. Yeah.
When you mentioned about bilateral movement while processing your past, it is really interesting. And I don't know enough to ask a super specific question, but I just would be curious to hear more about, as you did more, you said you kind of started with that idea, and as you did more research, or as you like actually played the game and had other people play it, has there been any more? Are you still thinking in the same ways about how movement and like how this game combines movement and inviting people to think about their own traumas? Has that evolved at all? Is there anything you've learned about putting those two things together?
Yeah, I think it's something that I'm interested in gathering more feedback on, is specifically kind of the movement and the emotional experiences of people. For the bilateral stimulation, I was not sure how to fit it in, but I actually found a way to fit it in the end, the service mode. So in the end, you just like progress it by going left and right, which I hope to be more evocative of EMDR. I don't do a lot of EMDR, so yeah, curious to see if anyone else has thoughts on that. But I think through this process, I'm realizing that like for myself, um, going through the motions of making this game, like getting good at DDR has helped me understand my mental health a little bit more too. And I've sort of noticed that like as I've played DDR in the arcade and like really gotten into it, that's like become sort of a flow state for me. Like I don't think about my traumas when I'm playing DDR. I'm just like really like I feel like it's one of the only places where I'm like not very burdened, which is really interesting.
We can take one more.
Okay, one more. Okay.
So I think that's really fascinating because I remember when I saw this, you present this in San Francisco,
Mhm.
watching it and thinking, wow, I had no idea you were that good at DDR. But I was, because I'm always terrible at it, and I was like, oh wow, you must have played it a lot. And so I'm curious, like, were there points in the development process where you realized, like, oh shit, in order to properly develop this, I need to get a lot better at DDR? Like, did you have to, like, practice being good at DDR in order to develop it? Where were the jank moments?
Yeah, I would say that um I think it wasn't like an obligation to me, like I must reach level 13 in order to publish this game or else it'll be fake. Like that wasn't in my mind. I think
I
I
think in terms of your own ability
yeah.
to test what you designed.
Yeah, I would say that going enough to like know the people who are playing DDR, to know the sort of classic songs that are in the DDR repository was important for me. I don't think I could have scored the songs as well as I could have if I didn't start playing at Dave and Buster's. Like I think if I just played at home and not gotten into the community, I don't think this game would have been as successful. Yeah, but I think on a different or side note, I think part of this game I'm really trying to realize that, or I'm really trying to convey that building your capacity is like the whole point. I think with like emotional healing, people are scared to put themselves out there. They're scared to try out different ways of living. But it's really a practice that you can build and you can get better at, and you can change the way that you behave and exist in the world um, with enough practice. And I feel like that's an interesting metaphor to go off from DDR, which is about like you just have to show up and try again, even though it can be like Han said, like scary and like intimidating. Okay, thank you so much.